The day my parents demanded that I hand over my penthouse to my sister started like any ordinary morning. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee, savoring the rare moment of calm before the day's meetings and deadlines, when my phone buzzed insistently. On the other end was my mother, her tone deceptively sweet but edged with that unmistakable undertone of authority I had grown weary of over the years. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I think it's time you let your sister have the penthouse," she said, almost as if she were discussing the weather. "She really deserves a place like that, don't you think?" I remember feeling my chest tighten. I had worked for years to save, invest, and finally purchase that penthouse, a space that was entirely mine. A sanctuary from the chaos that had always seemed to follow my family around. The idea that I should simply hand it over to my sister, who had never lifted a finger to earn anything, felt absurd. "I don't understand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's my property. I bought it myself. Why should I give it to her?" The line went silent for a moment, and then my father's voice came on, sharp and impatient. "Because it's family. That's why. You're being selfish, and frankly, you're lucky we even let you have it. You should do the right thing." That was the moment I realized that this wasn't about logic, fairness, or even love. It was about control. My parents, particularly my father, had always believed that their role was to orchestrate the lives of their children according to their own ideas of what was right. And I had just hit a point where their idea of right conflicted violently with my sense of justice. I refused. My refusal, I thought, would at least merit some conversation, some negotiation. But instead, it sparked something I wasn't prepared for. The next thing I felt was the sting of my father's hand across my face. The slap was sudden, sharp, and humiliating, and it left a burning heat on my cheek that I would feel for much longer than the physical pain. In that instant, a strange clarity settled over me. This was no longer a family disagreement. This was a test of boundaries, a line that had been crossed, and I realized that if I didn't act, I would continue to be treated as if my efforts, my independence, and my voice didn't matter. I would continue to be invisible in the shadow of entitlement and manipulation. The anger I felt wasn't the explosive, uncontrolled kind that leaves you breathless and screaming. No, it was the cold, focused sort of anger that sharpens your mind and hardens your resolve. I knew I had a choice. I could either give in, lose everything I had built, and let my sister and parents walk over me, or I could find a way to assert my independence in a way that would finally make them understand, once and for all, that I was not to be underestimated. Looking back, I realized that moment the slap, the words, the audacity of their demands was the trigger that set everything into motion. It wasn't just about a penthouse. It was about respect, fairness, and reclaiming the autonomy I had fought so hard to achieve. From that point onward, nothing would ever be the same. Before the confrontation over the penthouse, my life had a rhythm I cherished, a rhythm built from years of discipline, hard work, and careful planning. I had learned early on that independence wasn't given. It had to be earned, nurtured, and protected. My mornings began with quiet routines, a cup of strong coffee, a moment of reflection, and the satisfaction of knowing that I was building something truly my own. The penthouse, perched high above the city, was more than a home. It was a symbol of all the sacrifices I had made, a sanctuary that reminded me daily that I could create a life on my own terms. And yet, behind the walls of this sanctuary, there existed a family dynamic that had always kept me on edge. My parents, in their desire to protect my sister, had a way of dismissing the efforts of anyone who dared to take a different path. My sister, on the other hand, had been the family's favorite almost from birth. She was charming, persuasive, and deeply skilled at bending others to her will. Hard work was never her concern. She floated through life expecting opportunities to fall into her lap. Gifts, privileges, attention, everything was hers for the taking. And my parents encouraged her at every step. Growing up, I had tried to ignore the imbalance. I focused on my studies, my career, and eventually, my financial independence. I thought that creating a life for myself would be enough to insulate me from their favoritism. And for a while, it seemed to work. I pursued my career with determination, saved every extra penny, and finally achieved what felt like freedom. The purchase of my penthouse, a space that belonged entirely to me. But the first signs of trouble were subtle. My parents would make passing comments. It would be nice if your sister had a place like that. Or you're so lucky you have your own home. Maybe you could share it with her. At first, I brushed them off as casual suggestions. Harmless words meant to encourage family generosity. But over time, these comments evolved into demands, each one heavier and more insistent than the last. They began implying that my refusal to share the penthouse was a moral failing, painting me as selfish and ungrateful. Meanwhile, my sister's behavior grew bolder. She would casually stop by, wander through rooms as if she had a right to be there, and make flippant remarks about how nice it would be if this were mine. She smiled as if her entitlement were a given, and my parents always nodded along, reinforcing the idea that her whims deserved to be satisfied. I started to notice a pattern. Whenever I set boundaries, they were subtly undermined. Whenever I expressed pride in my achievements, they reminded me of the ways I should be giving back to family. Despite all this, I still loved my family in my own way. I understood their desire to care for my sister, but it had always been handled poorly. They didn't see my efforts, my sacrifices, or my independence as valid. To them, I was just a source of compliance, someone who could be molded, pressured, and persuaded to fit into their narrative of fairness, which, ironically, always favored my sister. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. The small suggestions that grew into demands, the casual dismissals of my feelings, the way my sister's confidence swelled under parental approval. All of it was leading to the inevitable clash. But in the moment, I was still naive enough to hope for reason, for a fair conversation, for acknowledgement of my hard work. I had not yet realized how far my parents and sister were willing to go to claim what they believed was theirs. I had a life I had built meticulously, yet I was constantly reminded that my accomplishments were secondary to my sister's entitlement. It was a strange, suffocating tension, a normal world that was mine in theory but constantly threatened by the people who should have been my support. And that tension would soon explode, starting with a single, unforgettable incident that would make it clear that the time for negotiation had passed. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, a day that should have been ordinary, calm, and peaceful. I had spent the morning tidying the penthouse, opening the windows to let sunlight spill across the hardwood floors, and enjoying the rare sense of solitude that came with living on my own. Then, without warning, my mother called, her voice carrying that familiar tone, equal parts insistence and expectation that something important was about to unfold. "I think we need to talk about the penthouse," she said, almost casually, as though the gravity of her words should be obvious. "Your sister really deserves it. It's only fair she has a proper place to live." At first, I tried to respond calmly, to reason with her. "Mom, I understand you want to help her, but this is my home. I worked for it, saved for it, and I'm not giving it away. There's nothing fair about taking someone else's work." Her sigh came heavy with disappointment. "You're being selfish. She's your sister, and family comes first. We expected more from you." I felt a pang of frustration, but I held my ground. I knew that giving in would only make things worse. And yet, as the conversation stretched on, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't going to be a discussion. It was a demand, a manipulation, and lurking behind their words was the unspoken threat: comply, or be cast as the villain. Then my father appeared on the line. His voice was sharp, authoritative, leaving no room for negotiation. "You will give her the penthouse. That's final. Don't test us. Don't argue. Do it." I remember the moment with crystal clarity. It was the way he said it, so absolute, so commanding, so utterly dismissive of my feelings that something inside me snapped. I could no longer pretend this was a matter of polite persuasion. It was an ultimatum, and it was laced with contempt. "I can't do that," I said firmly. My voice steadied despite the shock that began to ripple through me. "It's my home. I bought it with my own money. I'm not giving it to her. I won't." There was silence, and then, before I could even process what had just happened, I felt it. A sharp, burning impact across my cheek. My father had slapped me hard. The pain was immediate and shocking, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation, the disbelief, and the surge of anger that followed. I touched my face, still burning, still stinging, and looked around my penthouse, the sanctuary I had built, the space I had carefully nurtured, now tainted by an act of violence I had never imagined from my own father. For a fleeting moment, I questioned everything. My choices, my family, even myself. Had I been too stubborn? Had I somehow invited this? Then the anger returned. Not the kind that makes you yell or cry, but the kind that steels your spine and sharpens your mind. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach, and I realized something crucial. This was no longer just a conflict over property. This was a battle for respect, for autonomy, for the simple principle that my life and my work mattered. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. My sister's entitlement, my parents' manipulation, the slap, all of it formed a clear, undeniable truth. If I backed down now, I would lose everything I had fought for. But if I acted, I could finally reclaim control. Not with anger or revenge alone, but with strategy, evidence, and the unwavering knowledge that I was in the right. That moment, the slap, the words, the confrontation was the spark that ignited the entire chain of events. It marked the end of my patience, the death of hope for fairness through negotiation, and the birth of a plan. From this point forward, I knew I would have to fight, carefully and cleverly, to protect what was mine and to ensure that justice, in its most satisfying and karmic form, would finally be served. After that slap, the tension in my life didn't ease, it escalated. If anything, it intensified, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. My parents and my sister seemed almost emboldened by my refusal. Instead of stepping back, they pushed harder, testing my boundaries, my patience, and my very sense of self. My sister began acting as though the penthouse was already hers. She strolled through the rooms with an air of entitlement, casually dropping comments about how lovely the space would be if it were hers. She invited friends over under the guise of just visiting, and I would catch her arranging furniture or admiring my possessions as if she had a right to them. Each visit left a sour taste in my mouth, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and an unsettling realization that she truly expected the world to bend to her whims. Meanwhile, my parents escalated their pressure. They called daily, often multiple times a day, with the same refrain: "You're being selfish. She deserves this. We expected more from you." Every conversation was a calculated attack on my sense of reason. They weren't asking, they were dictating. And the more they insisted, the more their words became a relentless drumbeat of guilt and obligation. One afternoon, my mother arrived at the penthouse unannounced. She carried with her that saccharine smile that had always hidden manipulation behind a veil of affection. "I thought we could have a little family meeting," she said, setting down a cup of tea as though it were an olive branch. But there was nothing peaceful about the conversation. She and my father spent over an hour arguing that my sister was more deserving, that I was selfish, and that my refusal would damage the family forever. Each argument was meticulously structured to make me feel small, to convince me that my independence was a flaw rather than a triumph. It wasn't just emotional pressure, either. My sister began to flaunt her ambitions openly. She told me how she was planning the penthouse exactly the way I'd want it, describing imagined renovations and furniture arrangements, as if my consent were irrelevant. Her confidence was infuriating, but it also revealed a weakness. She didn't understand that the power she thought she wielded was entirely illusory. Despite all this, I refused to buckle. Every escalation from them only reinforced the truth I had known since the slap. I could no longer rely on reason or familial loyalty to protect what was mine. Their increasing demands and brazen entitlement were making the stakes crystal clear. This wasn't a temporary argument that would fade. This was a full-blown battle over my life, my property, and my dignity. During this period, I found myself meticulously documenting everything. Every conversation, every intrusion, every slight against me or my property went into careful mental notes, and soon, into written records. I started noticing patterns, the predictable ways my parents and sister manipulated situations, the recurring justifications for their actions, the moments they overstepped in ways that were clearly documented by time and presence. It was exhausting and infuriating, but it also became the groundwork for what would come next. Each day felt like a test. Each new act of entitlement, each new demand, each new violation of my personal space pushed me closer to a breaking point. But it also sharpened my resolve. I began to see not just the problem, but a potential solution, a way to protect myself and reclaim the life I had built, not through brute force or anger, but through careful, strategic action. By the end of this relentless period of escalation, it was undeniable. My sister and my parents had underestimated me, and their arrogance would be their undoing. They had doubled down, not realizing that every overreach, every act of entitlement, and every attempt to intimidate me was quietly strengthening my position, preparing me for the moment when I would finally turn the tables. The breaking point arrived quietly at first, disguised as an ordinary weekend. I had spent the morning tidying the penthouse, straightening cushions, and dusting shelves, small, habitual rituals that made the space feel like mine. I was enjoying the calm I could carve out for myself, thinking briefly that perhaps my family would take a break, leave me in peace for a day. How naive that thought was. It started with a phone call from a neighbor. "Your sister is here," they said casually. "She's having people over?" I could feel my stomach twist, a cold knot forming that spread quickly into a burning heat of anger and disbelief. I hurried to the penthouse, the elevator ride feeling longer than it ever had before. When I arrived, the scene that greeted me left me momentarily speechless. My sister had thrown a small party without my knowledge or my permission. Friends were scattered across the living room, sipping wine, laughing, and treating my home as though it had been theirs for months. My belongings were displaced, the furniture subtly rearranged, the kitchen cluttered with half-finished snacks and wine glasses. Every surface bore the mark of someone who felt entitled to everything I had worked for. I tried to speak calmly at first, reminding her and her friends that this was my home. "You can't just throw a party here without asking me," I said, my voice even but firm. But my words were brushed aside. My sister laughed, an almost mocking sound, and said, "Relax. You know, it's basically mine now. Mom and Dad said so." It was then that my parents arrived, not to stop her, but to reinforce the idea that I had no say in the matter. They scolded me gently, or at least tried to, with all the practiced charm of guilt-laden persuasion, suggesting that I should learn to be more generous and think about the family. Their voices dripped with the kind of moral authority only parents who never understood boundaries could muster. The culmination of this violation, this complete disregard for my autonomy, was almost too much to bear. For years, I had tolerated little invasions of space, quiet manipulations, and subtle guilt trips. But this was blatant, undeniable disrespect. It was a declaration that neither my sister nor my parents saw me as the person I had fought so hard to become. In their eyes, I was still the obedient child, the one who should surrender and comply. No matter how much I had achieved on my own at that moment, something shifted inside me. I felt a clarity I had not known before. The fear of conflict, the hesitation born of years of trying to keep the peace, evaporated. The anger that had simmered quietly since the slap became a cold, deliberate force, shaping a resolve I could not ignore. I was no longer willing to be the passive victim in this story. I would act. I would fight back, not recklessly, but strategically, using the tools and knowledge I had gathered over the years. I spent the rest of that evening reflecting on every previous encounter, every slight, every attempt at manipulation. The pattern was undeniable. Their arrogance, their entitlement, their belief that I could be coerced, these were weaknesses I could exploit. And so, the plan began to form in my mind, precise and deliberate. By the time the night settled in, and my sister and her friends had gone home, leaving the apartment in disarray, I had decided I would protect my home. I would assert my rights, and I would do it in a way that ensured my independence was recognized and respected. Once and for all, this wasn't just about the penthouse anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, enforcing boundaries, and ensuring that justice, in its most satisfying and direct form, was served. After that evening, as I stood amidst the disarray of my penthouse, a strange sense of focus settled over me. The anger that had simmered for weeks transformed into something far more useful: clarity. For the first time, I began to see the situation not just as a personal attack, but as a problem with a solution, a way to finally reclaim what was mine and ensure that my sister and parents could no longer overstep without consequence. The first thing I considered was the penthouse itself. It was fully mine. The deed was in my name alone, purchased entirely with my own money. Every document, every receipt, every mortgage payment was recorded, cataloged, and easily traceable. I had kept meticulous records over the years, knowing the value of evidence in any serious situation. Suddenly, these mundane pieces of paper became my greatest weapon. They were proof that no one had any legal claim over my home, no matter how entitled or manipulative they might be. Next, I remembered the security system I had installed months earlier. The cameras had captured everything, every unauthorized visit, every party thrown by my sister. Every moment she acted as though she owned the place. For years, I had considered the footage a precaution, a measure for safety and peace of mind. Now, it became central to my plan. Each clip was a record of trespassing, entitlement, and violation of my property rights. Taken together, they formed a compelling, undeniable narrative, one that would protect me and dismantle their argument. As I reviewed my options, I realized that the most powerful aspect of my plan wasn't just legality, it was strategy. I didn't need to confront them with anger or escalate verbally. I could let the facts speak for themselves. The law, combined with hard evidence, would strip away the veneer of parental authority and sisterly entitlement that they had relied on for so long. This was clever, calculated, and, most importantly, fair. I wasn't scheming for revenge. I was defending what was rightfully mine. I also began to plan the timing. I knew my sister would continue to test boundaries if given the chance, and my parents would keep pressuring me, hoping for a moment of weakness. I had to act decisively and without hesitation, ensuring that each step I took built upon the previous one. Calling in a lawyer to formalize notices, preparing the documentation, and compiling the security footage would not only protect me legally but would also create a situation in which my family could no longer challenge my ownership. There was a certain satisfaction in this realization. All of the small steps I had taken over the years, saving diligently, keeping records, installing security, and maintaining meticulous documentation, were finally converging into a tool that would allow me to take control. I had unknowingly been preparing for this confrontation my entire adult life. Every act of diligence, every choice to prioritize independence over approval, had positioned me perfectly for this moment. By the end of that night, my plan was clear. It was precise, calculated, and inevitable. I would enforce my ownership legally. I would present undeniable evidence of my sister's trespassing and disrespect, and I would do it in a way that was impossible for my parents or sister to twist or argue against. This wasn't just about protecting property, it was about asserting my autonomy, my dignity, and, ultimately, ensuring that justice was served. In that quiet reflection, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of control. The penthouse, my independence, and my life were mine. And with this plan, no amount of entitlement, manipulation, or pressure could take them away. I went to bed that night with a quiet confidence, knowing that the coming days would mark the beginning of the end for their arrogance, and the start of my vindication. The morning I decided to execute my plan, I woke with a sense of quiet determination. There was no panic, no frantic energy, just the steady, calm focus of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this very moment. Every detail I had gathered, every piece of evidence, every legal document, was ready. I knew that the next steps would not only protect my home, but also deliver a long overdue lesson in respect and accountability. The first step was to contact my lawyer. I arranged a meeting that same morning and laid out the entire situation. The ongoing pressure from my parents, my sister's repeated intrusions, the unauthorized parties, and, of course, the infamous slap that had triggered everything. My lawyer listened carefully, taking notes, and then smiled in a way that reassured me. "You've built a very strong case," they said. "We can make sure that your rights are protected, and that no one can interfere with your property again." With the legal framework in place, I moved to compile all the evidence I had collected over the past weeks. I organized the security footage, creating clear timestamps of every unauthorized entry, every trespass, Every moment my sister treated my home as if it were hers. I paired this with meticulous records of the purchase of the penthouse, all payments made, and the official deed proving that the property belonged solely to me. The more I reviewed it, the more undeniable it became. No one had a legitimate claim to this space except me. The next step was psychological. I knew that presenting this evidence calmly, confidently, and without anger would have a much greater impact than any shouting or confrontation. So I prepared myself mentally, rehearsing how I would present the documents, the footage, and the facts in a way that left no room for denial or manipulation. I wasn't out to humiliate anyone unnecessarily. I was out to ensure justice, and justice, I knew, was most satisfying when it was precise and irrefutable. The day came when my sister attempted to enter the penthouse again, under the pretense of just stopping by. But this time, I was ready. I calmly informed her that her access was no longer permitted and that any further attempts to enter would be treated as trespassing. She laughed at first, mocking my seriousness, but I didn't waver. I had already called the authorities as a precaution, and I knew that the law was firmly on my side. When she pushed further, insisting she had a right to be there, I presented the evidence. I showed the security footage, highlighting her previous parties and unauthorized visits. I displayed the legal documents proving ownership. My voice was calm, even, and steady, but each word carried the weight of preparation, diligence, and undeniable truth. I watched her expression change slowly from arrogance to disbelief. The smug confidence she had carried into my home for years began to crumble. My parents arrived shortly after, summoned by my sister's insistence that I was being unreasonable. They, too, expected to intimidate me with moral arguments and parental authority. But their attempts were instantly deflected. I presented everything: the deeds, the receipts, the footage, and the formal legal notice explaining clearly and patiently that the law supported me fully. They realized almost simultaneously that there was nothing they could do. No manipulation, no guilt, no threats would change the reality. I was the sole owner of the penthouse, and my rights were fully enforceable. At that moment, I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction. I wasn't gloating, and I wasn't shouting. I was simply asserting what was rightfully mine, and watching the layers of arrogance, entitlement, and manipulation peel away from my sister and parents in real time. The legal protections, combined with the undeniable evidence, had created a situation where their previous power was rendered completely ineffective. Executing the plan was not a single dramatic act, it was the culmination of careful preparation, evidence gathering, and calm, decisive action. Every step I had taken over the past weeks had built toward this moment. And now, as I stood in my penthouse, facing my sister's disbelief and my parents' frustration, I finally understood the full power of preparation, diligence, and measured resolve. This was more than a victory, it was a vindication. The moment my sister and parents fully grasped the reality of the situation was electric, though not in the dramatic, explosive way I had once imagined. There were no shouted accusations, no frantic scrambling at first. Just the slow, dawning realization that their carefully constructed plans had unraveled completely, and that I had orchestrated every move with precision. My sister's face went pale as I calmly displayed the evidence, the security footage of her parties, and unauthorized visits, the meticulously organized receipts showing my ownership, and, most importantly, the legal notice barring her from entering the penthouse without my permission. I watched as her confident, entitled posture slumped into disbelief. The arrogance she had relied on for years, the assumption that the penthouse would simply be hers, evaporated in the face of indisputable truth. She stammered, searching for words, trying desperately to reclaim some sense of control. "But this can't be legal. You can't. It's supposed to be mine." Her voice quivered, a stark contrast to the smug, dismissive tone she had carried in every previous encounter. Her protests were weak, disjointed, and increasingly frantic, and I could see the panic starting to set in. For the first time, she felt powerless in a situation she had always dominated. Then my parents arrived, drawn by the escalating argument, still expecting to assert authority and mediate in favor of their daughter. But as I presented the evidence systematically and without emotion, their faces shifted. First, confusion, then disbelief, finally, a simmering, impotent rage. They realized that no amount of parental influence, no moralizing, no emotional manipulation could override the law or my rights. It was a moment of poetic justice, almost cinematic in its irony. They had spent years trying to pressure me, belittle me, and coerce me into surrendering what was mine. They had backed my sister's entitlement, treating my hard work as an obstacle to be circumvented. And now, faced with irrefutable facts, they were rendered entirely powerless. Their threats and guilt trips were meaningless. Their favorite child's protests were impotent. I remained calm throughout. There was no need for shouting, no need for theatrics. I simply presented the truth as it was, methodically, logically, and undeniably. The law was on my side, and the evidence spoke louder than any argument they could muster. I could feel the tension in the room shift, no longer the oppressive weight of manipulation, but a quiet, satisfying vindication. My sister's downfall was complete when the realization hit her fully. She had been acting on assumptions, entitlement, and parental favoritism, but none of it could override reality. Her power, built on arrogance and manipulation, crumbled instantly. The same arrogance that had allowed her to stroll through my penthouse, host unauthorized parties, and treat my home as her own became the very thing that highlighted her vulnerability. I watched, almost with a sense of detached admiration, as my parents attempted one last time to argue, to guilt, to twist the narrative. But their words bounced off me. I had anticipated every objection, documented every scenario, and fortified my position with evidence that could not be denied. Their frustration boiled beneath the surface, visible in tight jaws, flared nostrils, and the faint shaking of hands. They had no path forward, no leverage, no legal standing, and no moral authority strong enough to challenge what was clearly mine in that room. Surrounded by the consequences of years of entitlement, manipulation, and misjudgment, the roles had finally reversed. I was no longer the child being coerced, guilted, or belittled. I was the owner of my space, my life, and my independence. They were the ones stripped of power, helpless before the very rules and facts they had thought they could manipulate. It was satisfying in a way that anger alone could never achieve. The downfall was complete not through spite, but through careful preparation, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And in that quiet, tense confrontation, the reality became clear. Entitlement and arrogance can only carry someone so far before the truth, and those who respect it reveal their fragility. The final moment of vindication arrived almost like a quiet storm. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies portray revenge, with shouting and chaos. It was precise, deliberate, and deeply satisfying because it was rooted in truth and consequence. My sister, fully aware that her assumptions had failed, attempted one last act of defiance. She tried to step past me, reaching for the door as though she could simply walk back into the life she had imagined was hers. I held up the legal notice, the documents and security footage still displayed on my phone, and said calmly, "You are not permitted to enter this property without my consent. This is your final warning." There was no hesitation in my voice, no room for negotiation. The calmness, paired with the undeniable evidence before her eyes, struck harder than any shouting or pleading could have. Her protests began to crumble. "You can't. This isn't fair," Mom and Dad said. Her voice faltered, her usual entitlement replaced with a fragile panic. The veneer of confidence she had worn for years disintegrated as she realized she was powerless in this situation. Even my parents' attempts to intercede were futile. The law, the evidence, and my composure left them no room to maneuver. At that moment, I contacted the authorities. It was simple and procedural. Trespassing, unauthorized access, and documented violations of property rights. Within minutes, the reality of her situation hit my sister with full force. Police arrived and escorted her from the penthouse. She shouted, "It's mine. You can't do this to me." But her words rang hollow, echoing against the walls of a home she had never truly earned. I watched from the doorway as she was guided down the hall, the situation unfolding exactly as I had planned. There was no dramatic collapse or cinematic rage, just the quiet, undeniable consequence of actions built on entitlement and disregard for boundaries. Her power, which had been so carefully cultivated through manipulation and favoritism, evaporated in the presence of law, evidence, and preparation. My parents remained behind, standing awkwardly in the living room. I could see the helpless frustration etched across their faces, the realization that they could no longer bend reality to their will. All the guilt trips, all the attempts to coerce, all the favoritism they had used as leverage were meaningless against the simple truth. The penthouse belonged to me, and justice had been served. I closed the door behind them, literally and symbolically. It wasn't a gesture of cruelty, but of boundary and finality. This home, my life, and my autonomy were now secure. I no longer had to navigate the constant intrusion of entitlement or parental interference. The battle was over, the lesson clear. Arrogance and greed, no matter how nurtured, eventually collapse in the face of diligence, preparation, and the truth. Standing alone in my penthouse, I finally allowed myself a deep breath. The space felt entirely mine again, restored not just physically but emotionally. Every ounce of effort, every precaution, every moment I had spent protecting what I earned had culminated in this perfect alignment of justice. There was no bitterness, only satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing that right has prevailed, not through chance, but through intelligence and unwavering resolve. In that moment, I understood the full meaning of karmic justice. The consequences my sister and parents faced were direct results of their own entitlement and arrogance. I hadn't sought revenge. I had enforced truth. And in that enforcement, I found a peace that made every struggle, every insult, and every challenge worth enduring. Asterisk. The days and weeks following the confrontation were remarkably calm, almost surreal. The chaos and tension that had dominated my life for months began to dissipate, leaving behind a sense of order and peace that I hadn't realized I had been craving. My sister, once so confident and entitled, retreated completely. She avoided the penthouse entirely, choosing instead to dwell in the world she had always assumed was hers. I didn't gloat or relish her absence. I simply let it be, understanding that the consequences of her own actions had cemented the boundaries I had fought so hard to enforce. My parents, meanwhile, shifted into a new, more cautious dynamic. The arrogance and entitlement that had driven them to pressure me, so relentlessly were tempered by the reality that I could no longer be manipulated. Phone calls were shorter, conversations more restrained, and any attempt to discuss the penthouse or exert influence over my life was met with polite firmness and unwavering boundaries. I noticed that, for the first time, they began to treat me with the respect that had long been due. Their realization was slow, subtle, but undeniable. I was no longer a child to be coerced. I was an adult, whose independence was both protected and unshakable. As for me, life settled into a rhythm that felt genuinely my own. I continued to enjoy my penthouse as I had always intended: quiet mornings with coffee and sunlight, evenings with books and music, and weekends that were entirely under my control. The space had always been more than just a home. It was a reflection of my hard work, my independence, and my ability to create a life on my own terms. Now, it was also a symbol of triumph, a tangible reminder that boundaries, when enforced with intelligence and patience, can hold firm against even the strongest forces of manipulation. I also took the time to reflect on the lessons learned. The confrontation had been painful, humiliating at times, and emotionally draining, but it had also been illuminating. I realized that being prepared legally, emotionally, and mentally was essential in protecting what is rightfully yours. The experience reinforced the importance of clear boundaries, careful documentation, and unwavering resolve in the face of entitlement and injustice. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded me that true justice is not about anger or revenge. It's about ensuring that the consequences of one's actions are clear, fair, and directly connected to their choices. Months later, when I look back on that period, I no longer feel the sting of my father's slap or the frustration of my sister's entitlement. Instead, I feel a deep sense of satisfaction and closure. My home remains my sanctuary, my independence intact, and my family dynamic, though complicated, is now defined by mutual respect rather than coercion. I have learned that the most powerful victories are those that come from patience, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to fairness. In the end, the penthouse was more than a property. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for, everything I had protected, and everything I had earned. And in defending it, I had not only reclaimed my home but also asserted the principle that no amount of manipulation, entitlement, or arrogance can override the truth. Life returned to a new normal, one where my autonomy was respected, my boundaries upheld, and justice, in its most satisfying form, had been fully realized. The story closed not with bitterness, but with calm triumph, a reminder that preparation, courage, and patience can turn even the most challenging conflicts into lasting victories. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.